in.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Arts Chat. Today we're going to be focusing on arts and creating art for social impact. This is a part of a collaboration between the NYUAD Career Development Center and the NYUAD Art Center to kind of bridge the gap between the audience and the creators of the art that we see here on campus, and so we can engage in a more fruitful conversation about art making. Today we are joined by Kaneza Schaal and Meyers, co-creators of photography. They're both New York City-based artists, and we're so glad to have you guys here today.
We're glad to be here.
So I think my first question is, we would like to hear a lot more about your previous work together, like Jack Ant and Go Forth, and specifically how you think art and art making can create social impact in the community, and just elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts on that.
Well, a good starting point is talking about stories, and Christopher and I share the belief that stories build the world, that they build architecture and policy and our social and political interaction. So we are in the business of telling stories. And as a theater maker, I believe that great storytelling requires speaking many languages, and that those are aesthetic and creative and formal languages, and those are also cultural and historical and experiential languages. So much of the work comes out of looking to use vast lexicons, and I come out of experimental performance, and a lot of the work that I was involved with played to very, very small audiences, and I believe that if we make work that speaks many languages, it can speak to many people.
In terms of the work we've done together, one of the things that we've found is that theater is unique in that it's one of the few things that is always taken in communally. You know, if you write a book or if you make a painting, the mode of communication is pretty much one-to-one. Lots of people can come through the museum, lots of people can read the book, but that moment of engagement with the text is very personal and very, very direct. Whereas theater happens in this community, and every time you gather people in a theater, in a church, in a religious venue, in anything like this, even in this room, we're implying and we're making a small community. And the questions of what does that community need, what does that community want, how does that community imagine itself, those are the questions that we're interested in. And oftentimes what we find is that theater is used as a way for communities to talk to themselves about who they are. That's why we kind of come together, is to have these kind of public discussions. Going back to, you think about models like Greek theater and democracy, and how there's a deep relationship between those things. We're interested in the conversations that communities have with themselves about who they are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think this whole idea of storytelling, I think also can go beyond, you know, what happens in the theater, and like people being able to kind of tell their stories outside of it as a result of kind of seeing these things. And so I wonder, did you guys ever think of your work initially as social, kind of for social impact, or is that something that you think kind of came about after you've sort of dabbled in like visual arts or in performance making? How did that kind of thought about art being made for social impact kind of come through your process or your work?
I think it comes from a pursuit of excellence, and that I really believe that you get good at what you do, whether you're a baker or a lawyer or a theater maker, by really addressing the materials in your practice. And so for me, social practice and creative practice are inextricably linked, because the material you're working in is all these languages that we've talked about, and how well you can address those languages is where great art making lives. And I think that's something that one bumps up against tremendously when making work that might attach to a social content in any way. On the one hand, there's kind of an aesthetic assumption. We're doing a piece for children about migration. There's all these aesthetic assumptions about what that piece is going to look like, right? Or when speaking to an artistic director about your practice and how a piece might fit into their season, there can be a lot of assumptions about how work with a impulse around social practice might fit into a luminary cultural institution. And so I really do feel that that at the core of a great art practice is an addressing of social practice.
Right.
And to be quite frank, I don't see, there's no like artistic or even creative endeavor that isn't political, right? So everything implies the community. Everything implies who we're, an audience to whom we're speaking and an audience that we are excluding. That's true of every kind of speech. So whether it's a newspaper or a politician, I mean politicians are made of theater, right? All of these things have political impetus, have political intention, have political weight. What is interesting is when that political impetus, intention, and weight is denied. So when someone says, no, I'm just talking to people, and they're somehow erasing the idea that they're talking to very specific people, you know, but no one, the people who are lying about it are the people who we are kind of, I mean, it's fair to say that we are against, right? Anytime that someone kind of naturalizes their speech to say, no, there's nothing specific about my speech. It's just, you know, I'm just talking like people do. That is usually a lie, and it is usually a lie in the service of an exclusionary politics, and that's interesting to us. And we're interested in making work that points out that sense of, I mean, there's in the play Cartography, there's one little section that we worked on in which Victoria stands on top of the boxes and gives a generic speech, and it's the speech that you're hearing more and more around the world about, we will be unified, we will stand together, and we will be together in our togetherness. It's very like circular. That speech you're hearing in every kind of country nowadays.
Yeah.
From, you know, Duterte to I was just being. I'm
Filipino,
I think that's why I thought. I was like, wow, Chris, you're a little racist. That's okay.
It's okay, no offense.
From Duterte to Trump to whoever it is, there's that same speech of we are together and we believe in freedom. And every time someone says that, you know that they are excluding someone and that they don't believe in freedom for that person, you know. And that's the kind of question that we're interested in, is how do these terms, these performances become inversions of themselves? And that's why complicated experimental artists need to get in there, and you should be a politician.
This is actually very reaffirming for me to hear, because I'm a theater student here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and one of the things we always think about is how do we sort of use our art to be kind of reflective of the environments that we're in. Like, we come from very different places, and how do we kind of use this performance avenue to sort of not just reflect where we come from, but kind of sort of have these discussions. And it's been kind of like, for me, like reaffirming to hear that this is, there are other people also on the same page about this. But actually I was taking a class in New York, arts and social practice, and I remember one of the discussions that we had was that, how do you measure social impact in terms of creating art? Like, there were a lot of people taking this class and were like I make art, like art can't feed, like, you know, the hungry. Like, this is like a direct quote that like they were saying this was kind of where the conversation was revolving. And I was wondering if you guys have any sort of thoughts on people who say, like, how do you measure the impact of like social impact art or art that is made to kind of provoke or create this kind of conversations about where we are as a society, and how would you kind of think about your work, whether being it like successfully creating social impact or not, or if there's even a binary in terms of measuring that?
A few thoughts on that. In a lot of the work, it's not always what we talk about, but there's often some bigger story that is fueling some of the asking of questions. So you referenced Jack And earlier, and that's a performance we made that's thinking about re-entry to society after prison. And it stars an artist who we had an ongoing relationship with, who I had first seen perform when he was serving time in prison. And when he got out after serving 33 years, we began working together. And we had a lot of issues working together because of dealing with the New York City Parole Board. And ultimately, we had to make another piece, which became Jack And, in order to address our creative conversation because it got deeply interrupted by the New York City Parole Board. So in that piece, we're thinking about how do we think about not only the time someone serves, but the measure of an individual's dreaming that gets given to the state while serving time in prison. And there's an underlying story that piece is thinking about, and an impulse to rehabilitate national narratives in the United States about mass incarceration. And that if we could change the broader stories of how we think about the carceral state and how we think about an individual's guilt and innocence, if we could get out of this obsession with guilt and innocence where the greatest miscarriage of justice is the sentencing of an innocent person. If we could get out of that story, that I genuinely believe would begin to unwind how the carceral state works. So the idea that telling stories and how we tell stories is at the core of the work exists in many concentric circles, both like individual, the exchange in the audience, and also thinking about broader questions we're telling ourselves in civic space. We were talking about this math. Was anyone in the class earlier today? No, we were talking about this question in theater class earlier today. And stories move in fascinating ways that are hard to capture. And I think that Chris and I, does anyone know the show that, what's it called? Issa Rae's show, Insecure. It's this TV show. So we looked up the numbers of how many people actually watched that show, and it was pretty small how many people actually watched that show. But there was a moment in New York City where her face was plastered over every billboard, and the ideas in the show were circulating in a way that was disproportionate to the audience that she had. And so I'm interested in the kind of algorithms of how ideas move that are beyond what we can capture in metrics.
Metrics they're very current in our society. The idea of we should be able to measure the impact of an art show, a television show, whatever like that. And I'm interested in kind of escaping the noose that metrics provide, but on the other side, I think it's important to note ways in which these.
I'll go get her.
She doesn't believe in metrics either. There's a way in which there's a way in which we can slip the noose of the way that like public institutions ask for metrics in relationship to art practices when we think of it the other direction, which is how many public institutions are now hiring artists, engaging with artists. So for example, I used to split time between New York and Vietnam. When I first got to Vietnam in like 2010, there was the cultural police are there, but they were not necessarily educated in culture, right? By the time that, maybe about 6 years later, they had hired art historians to be on the cultural police in Ho Chi Minh City. Why are they hiring art historians to be in the cultural police? If this thing did not matter, if the importance of art to a society was negligible, you would not in any way have art historians on the cultural police. You know, I mean, there was a time in which we understood that there were artist politicians. You think of Václav Havel, you think of Leopold Sédar Senghor, artist politicians, Aimé Césaire, from Martinique, France, Senghor, you guys, yes. And there was an understanding that the people who had songs to sing about the creation of nations, that all nations were like created as these like massive poems of identity formation, right? That these people were important. And slowly, the other politicians who were maybe worse artists said, we don't need artist politicians. But at the same time, they're hiring advertising firms and people to like make video, make ads. They're as much engaging with the artistic world. So rather than think of the metrics of how artists like ourselves are affecting society, it's maybe also interesting to look at societal institutions, politicians, police forces, and ask, why are they hiring artists? How are they affecting the arts? And I think that when we look at it from that direction, it's one way to kind of lose this weight that is so much on artists to prove that they are important. To say, if we're not important, then why are you hiring art historians?
In a way, then, do you think that art making, and not just, going beyond like performance creation, then do you think that art kind of catalyzes these conversations, but specifically looking at cartography, focusing on migration, do you think that by, a community of audiences coming to see these shows kind of catalyzes these conversations about like where we've come from and where we are and where we go from here?
Right. That's the intention. I mean, one of the gifts of doing this show in a place like Cleveland, right, which is the center of the United States, a place that imagines itself far away from the questions of borders and migration, is how quickly people begin to see that that these stories implicate their own lives. Mm-hmm. That within 1 or 2 generations of everyone sitting in the audience, when you do this like mapping exercise, they realize, wait, everyone here is related. Everyone here has in their past a great migration. And those great migrations then get to be not so far off, and get to be less foreign and become more integrated within the fabric of the society at large. Yeah.
We'd like to open it up to questions now. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for Kaneza and Chris? Yeah.
It's a question I wonder about with the at large, but specifically for art, for social impact, is the question of accessibility and who feels welcome in the audience. So how do you get the right people in the room in the first place? How do you get connected to the right people? Is that something that you guys have noticed as a Fishbia?
That's a large part of our work, to be very honest, is first making the work in such a way that it can be as open to people as we'd like it to be, but also doing the and bringing in collaborators who bring in other perspectives, like those cats over there. So that I think is one central tenet, is the idea that you build the work as if you were preparing a meal for a bunch of people. Then the second thing is to do the recruiting work to invite people into these spaces, because what we have found, and what definitely my own personal experience is that any space that imagines itself as neutral is also deeply disinviting. So you take someone, my father did not like to go to museums. I had like openings at museums and he would not go because he said, well, you know what I mean, but it's one of them fancy museums. They're just gonna see an old black man in here and they're gonna be like, whatever. That was his idea. And you know, we all have aunts, uncles, cousins who are like, you know, I mean, like most of my cousins who still identify me as, you know, that cat who reads all the books. You're like, Chris, you still reading books? Yeah, still reading books, it's true. Man, he was reading books before, now he's still reading books. But there's a level of disinvitation that comes with just the four walls of a university, the four walls of a theater. And we have to do work to invite people. What we find is that it's rarely the work itself that is not inviting. It's the institution itself that isn't inviting. And that's something to keep in mind, you know, that whenever we're in a community in which there is an invisibility that is practiced and put on some of the members of that community. No matter what happens, no matter where you are, there's always this moment of, that's somebody who's around all the time, but I mean, we didn't think of them as like part of the community. But of course, you know, and so we have to do a lot of work to invite members of the community, and that's one of the things that we like that's going on here, but that's something that we find in so many places, that there is an important task in inviting the members of our community to be there.
Theaters so often imagine themselves to be public space, and so much of the work is about what does it mean to actually make our theaters function as public space. In New York City, you know, the city is 60% people of color, but if you go to a theater, that is rarely what is reflected in the room that you are attending. And so a tremendous amount of our work is about that frame around the piece. And I think the tools that get in there the most effectively is understanding that it is actually within your art practice, that work. So when I'm negotiating a contract with a theater in Seattle, the site visit is actually a engagement visit in many ways. And you know, for a piece like Jack And, we worked with everyone from the DA's office to huge organizations that serve like thousands of people as they're getting out of prison, to really small grassroots organizations that are led by people who serve time. And that was a part of the artistic proposition, because with this idea of many languages, if you do not have people in the room for whom the poetry is legible, the piece will disappear. You know, theater lives in its contact with an audience. We were doing cartography just before we came here, and there was one evening we were in this big house, like 1,500 seat house, and in the orchestra was a dance maker, a cool kind of like avant-garde dance maker. You know, friend, great person, friend. And in the balcony, in the third balcony, was a mother who had walked across the border with her 2 children from El Salvador. And she was, after the show, she was weeping, and she found Hazel and she found Janice, and she was telling this story, and she was talking about what does it mean to process their stories in this new environment, and feeling like, you know, do their stories actually live on the other side of a border, and what does it mean to process these stories with her children. And she was weeping. And the dance artist came up to me and she was like, oh, yeah, I mean, I was surprised it wasn't that sad, you know? And I was like, oh, you know, and there were a few formal things that she liked. She liked a few formal things about the show. So she got a snack. But at the feast that we prepared, the feast had been prepared on behalf of very particular audiences, and they got to eat. And our dance performer is used to the entire performance being prepared on her behalf, right? When she walks into the theater, the feast should be prepared for her on the terms that she expects work to exist. And so I think some of the challenge in all of it is best addressed when you keep the art at the center. And when you say, for this work to exist, I need people who can read it with me, who can realize it with me. Theater is this mini participatory society.
Kaneza's really good at throwing shade.
There was a mention of storytelling before, when I think of like stories and social impact, I think of like who gets to tell like whose story, and when you're in your creative process or research, to what extent are the affected communities or people, representatives, part of that process and a part of telling that story?
Right. Well,
We love that who tells whose stories.
well, I mean, as a question, it's super fascinating to us. I'll tell you one story and then a set of considerations that are kind of current for me and for Kaneza, I think for all of us. The story is about, in my other life, I publish books, right? And I have an imprint at Random House. And so when we were working with these young people in 2016 in Munich who had all traveled alone to Munich from various places in which, there's a poet, Meyers, who says, if you have to leave, no one leaves home because they're like comfortable. If you have to leave home, it's because home is the mouth of a shark, right? So all these young people have had to leave home, and one of them, young brother, impossibly charming, from Syria, I said, Joe, do you want to write a book about your experiences? 17 years old. And he looked at me, and he said, do you have dentists where you're from? And I'm like, I'm from Brooklyn. Yes. He's like, where I'm from, slightly bougie kid too, And he's like, we've got dentists, these things? And I was like, yes, Abdullah, I got you. He says, if something's wrong with my mouth, I'm gonna go to a dentist. It's my mouth, I know all the things about my teeth, but I'm gonna go to a dentist. He's like, I'm a 17-year-old kid trying to figure out whether or not I need to learn German or English or French or what right now. You're a storyteller. Your job is to tell stories. And that changed my perspective a little bit in terms of like my generalized fears of ventriloquism, right? I don't want to be telling other people's stories. At the same time, what I care for is storytelling, and storytelling is what I do. And there is this idea that, we have a special role as people who care about storytelling. That's important. How then can you tell these stories without participating in a type of ventriloquism, without participating in a type of speaking for others or telling stories that aren't your place to tell? And I think that the first thing, and this is why I think being artists is important, the first thing is to understand that we are engaging in a ritual of storytelling. We're not reporters. Even reporters, as far as I'm concerned, aren't reporters, right? Like, they are engaging in their specific ritual of storytelling. Another kind of moment, I had a friend who was the Latin American bureau chief for Newsweek, the magazine, a number of years back. And he was lamenting the idea that every time he heard stories of border crossing, he heard the stories in laughter. He heard the stories around dinner tables with families who were talking about, man, did you know Uncle Chucho stayed in that trunk for 3 days? How'd he stay in the trunk for 3 days? He brought a book. A book? That kind of thing. That he heard the stories in laughter. But then when he reported it to Newsweek, to the audience of like concerned readers, he had to report it in terror. And he felt like he was robbing something from the stories. He felt like he was stealing some bit of humanity from the people who were telling the stories. And this idea of what can we do as storytellers to carry the humanity not only of the people that we have heard from, but also carry the humanity of ourselves as people who listen with a kind of a generous ear, a kind of ear that's open to different kinds of languages. So I think that these are thorny issues, right? On one hand, I am in no way interested in ventriloquism. I'm in no way interested in someone communicating to me how sensitive and sad they feel like a story can be. That is oftentimes what you hear. I mean, a very, very clear example is Rwanda. When we're in Rwanda, every time you meet someone who's from outside Rwanda and they introduce you to a Rwandese person, they like whisper to you in hushed tones the horrors of the genocide that happened to that person who is not them, right? So they'll sit there and you'll be at a like a dinner table and you'll meet somebody and be like, hey, that's George, oh, that's cool. And then later on, like Stacy from Canada will say, George had a hard time during the, oh my God, blah, blah, blah. I am not interested in that kind of storytelling. At the same time, I also am interested in the idea that oftentimes George doesn't talk about, no one introduces themselves being like, so this is what happened to me during the genocide. More often, you're built, things like genocide are talked about in gaps, in aporias, in lacuna, like this idea of like the space around a kind of trauma that one carves. And we're as much in love with that as we are in, you know, this quote unquote story. So I think that there are lots of ways to tell stories, that we are engaged as storytellers, as people who care for stories more than we're necessarily caring for the specific identity of this person or that person. In the piece, the only specific stories that are told are the stories of the actors that are in the piece, but they're cared for by all of us as storytellers collectively. So I guess set of thorny issues, yes.
Also, sometimes I think it's how we handle the materials. And if you could tell my story more effectively than I can, bless your soul, do it. I don't think you can, because I know me really well, but you might be an incredible writer and you could actually write it better than me. And if you can, I think you should. And that's where I stand on it. I'm excited by that. Did you guys see Zootopia? Okay, Zootopia is awesome, right? It's pretty cool. It's pretty thoughtful. It's pretty complicated. Written by all white people. We like looked at the writer's room. I think there was like one person of color in the writer's room.
So wait, a little flashback to why we're talking about Zootopia. Sometimes.
Can I respond to this? What do you think of American Dirt now? There's like a lot of controversy about that story. So how do you respond?
Well, the people who organized the protest called me the day before they met with the publishers, because I'm in publishing world, someone that people come to, and my thought is this: I'm in no way about censorship. I think that the challenge with American Dirt is not. So American Dirt is a novel written by a woman who it was not her experience. It's about migration. It's about, and a lot of folks kind of came for the book and came for her. Things I think are interesting. One is that I'm not at all interested in censoring a book. I think there are room for multiplicities of stories, and there need to be room for multiplicities of stories. I also don't necessarily believe that everybody is an expert on themselves, as anyone who's ever been to therapy can tell you. That's true. At the same time, I do think that when these stories become imbued with a certain kind of authenticity, which I really, to be very honest, I think that the problem is our authenticity narratives. I think that, you know, what I've found with authenticity over the years is that authenticity, I'm going to say this, authenticity is an invention of the British. I really believe this. This is like a strange thing, where all of a sudden, all of us brown people, all of the gender, all became subject to not being authentic enough. And I see this in all of my friends, in all of my communities, all of the various communities in which I overlap, is all of these people thinking that they're not authentic enough to tell their own story, to tell their parents' story. I mean, you hear people, and while all of these people think that we're not authentic enough to tell a story, they feel completely authentic enough to tell whatever story they want. And I am a big advocate of people feeling authentic enough to tell stories. At the same time, I'm also interested in changing the institutions to be more responsive to a story that is told in a way that is not that is not necessarily in their language, in all the various kinds of languages we're talking about. I'm interested in changing the institutions to be more responsive to that than they are to hearing themselves mirrored back. And I think that a book like American Dirt is a mirror of the people who are publishing the book. And therefore, of course, it speaks to them. They want to hear from that woman on that topic because they want to hear from people like themselves. And more power to them for wanting that. But they should also understand that there are other ways of telling these stories, and that these other ways are perhaps more important, and that in educational institutions, in artistic institutions, the multiplicity of languages is one of our strongest forces. It's in fact, and this is what I go back very quickly to the authenticity thing. The people who feel the least authentic are the people who speak the most languages, right? Like, there is an idea that this kind of topsy-turvy authenticity model is somehow that there is a perfect person who is the most authentic, who has never even heard of the West, for example. And therefore all of us comebacks and all of us people who went somewhere and got educated and come back, we don't feel as authentic, you know? And I think that's so dangerous. And I don't want that for any of the people whose voices I care for.
Do you want to go back to the Zootopia?
Oh, Zootopia.
I want to comment on that for a second though, because part of that, I feel like what Chris is saying is about how we tend to the materials, and how we tend to the materials as writers or as artists or in whatever field we're in. But the materials of that story, who needed to be there to actually consider, edit, refine how that story got told, and who are the hands that can care for these ideas.
And quickly about Zootopia, we were on a plane. Where were we flying to?
I don't remember. Cairo, maybe?
We were flying to Cairo. I was watching Zootopia. It made me cry because I related to it, because it's this whole thing where there's carnivores and then not carnivores, and then there was a whole thing with the Boy Scouts, and I identified with it very much because there was this thing where I was a Boy Scout, and you feel like no matter what you do, you can't escape the performance that people want to put on you, right? And I was crying.
I turned over Chris. I've seen Chris cry maybe like 2 times before that. We know each other for 12 years.
That's just a lie. You see me cry like 172 times.
But not like that. You were in it. You were in it. And we were on an airplane, and I looked over. It was a cartoon. I was like, he's watching cartoons and weeping? What is going on? So then I watched it.
And we both thought, wow. And then she watched it because culture. And and there was this moment there's this moment of being like, wow, this is an insightful, interesting way of thinking about what it is to be a minority in a different kind of culture and all this kind of thing. And then we were like, wow, this had to be written by, like, I assumed, I don't know,
a traumatized group of
I really assumed it was all a bunch of like former African American Cub Scouts or someone, and it wasn't. It was just a bunch of white dudes who I guess also, you know. So there's this thing about, you know, there are great storytellers are open to more than one language, and that's what makes you a great storyteller, is that you're open to, as an institution you're open to, and that's beautiful.
I really like the conversation around authenticity versus sincerity. So I'm interested in performing or forming the diasporic experience. So I haven't watched the show yet. I'm going to watch it this weekend. I'm grappling with that, right? Authenticity versus sincerity. And then out of what you guys said, I kind of glean on where you are seated. Another thing that I'm grappling with in terms of social artists and activism is intention versus action. So you might have the intention for social justice, and reflect that in your artwork. But then, in terms of translating that intention into action, I haven't seen your show yet. But then I'm actually curious to know if part of your proposition is that envisioning of how that social justice looks like. Like, what is that social justice for you?
I feel like I often have the experience of going to see a piece that sounds really wonderful, that paragraph description in a brochure, and then I go and see the piece, and what I see is the grant application, and not some transformation of these ideas or real engagement with the ideas. And I keep coming, because I work in performance, I keep coming back to the room and feeling like how the ideas, the design, the aesthetic choices, how all of those are actually addressed in a space between people is where the actual connective tissue can live in lifting the ideas or moving the ideas in the world. I care very much about the art part, and I think that those things go hand in hand to me, that there isn't an either or.
And what we're doing very specifically is we're fighting narratives that are already out there. And I think that as we see these narratives, especially about migration, kind of spreading across the world in insane ways, fascinating ways, Yeah, I was just in Bangladesh in the Rohingya camps, right? And there's a narrative about migration going on there, which is fascinating, because here you have people who have been in a country, in Myanmar, for generations, and yet what they're being told that they are not of Myanmar, right? And it has to do with the solidarity of a nation, and what does our conception of nation mean? How do we think of nation? So these narratives are already out there doing work. Action is being taken around the narratives. The stories the stories precede the action, always. When you think of, we've been talking a bit about genocide as a media event. You cannot have genocide without a national narrative. That's how it works. And so the stories come first. We talk about radio in Rwanda. We talk about the presence of these. So if the narratives come first, by changing the narrative, hopefully people leave this piece and they can no longer make the story that anyone lives in a linear fashion. That we put the lie to the authenticity of nation. Hopefully. That we kind of remind everybody about their Benedict Anderson and imagined communities, and the idea that all nations are fictions and their borders are fictions, and if you go back 5 generations, you'll see that. And if we can force that narrative, if we can displace that narrative, that's all the action we need to take.
We'll take a last question.
To offer a little bit of context, so I'm currently writing a play about the war that happened in Yemen, and I'm struggling to tackle, so I really want to shed light on the humane aspect of it, rather than making it political. That may sound like I'm offering a political statement that may then bring up the question of, again, who do you think you are and whatnot, even though it is personal and it is direct. However, so anything personal can be political, and anything political can be personal. And I'm just wondering if you can tackle a thin line between those two, and how do you do that when you're working with theater? How do you shed light on just the human aspect of it, writing about the injustices without having to be so specific with the politics? How do you just kind of,
For me, the word that's come up in the last few days especially is generosity. If you're being generous as a storyteller, that is the way to get rid of this way of thinking politically that is flat, that doesn't deal with both the nuance and the subtlety and the reality of one situation. the moment of generosity of working with these 4 actors specifically and thinking about their own stories, that generosity is one of the most powerful moments in the piece. That generosity that was, you know, that Kaneza was like, what we need to do is we need to bring that moment. Generosity outstrips any amount of propaganda. Propaganda doesn't have a generousness to it. It's a repetition. And repetition has its own magic, of course, but generosity beats that. And what you find in the best storytellers is a moment of generosity, a moment of kind of revelation. And that is how we kind of slip even the binary of personal and political is in that act of generosity, I think.
I also think that what you like matters. How you like to do it matters. I mean, cartography is the most play-like thing I've ever touched, other than as an audience member. And a really well-written, beautifully performed, cared for, straight play, as they would say, is delightful. I love going to the theater and seeing a play where I'm supposed to imagine that it's really happening right there in front of me in the theater. And I think that what excites you is part of how you can get to that generosity, is taking care of where your excitement actually lives. And however that lives formally or poetically or any other way.
Also, just to add on to that, form is also really a big part of it. Take a form limitations in that way really are what creativity is about. Creativity is not about just like blah. It's like take a form, take an epic poem that I'm like currently looking for like epic poems that Rohingya folks have had, because using the form, interrupting the form, playing with the form is a way to kind of enrich the entire thing. And again, slip this like, is it personal? Is it political? Like no, this is I'm part of an ancient tradition, and you are. No matter, you know, anytime we're sitting with a bunch of people surrounding us, we're like part of some really old tradition, and remembering that is super important. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I really learned a lot.
Before we end, I just want to thank again these incredible artists, Bernice, for putting herself in the hot seat as moderator. I also want to point out that every semester we create a reference library around the works and around the themes. So these artists have helped to create some of those titles. They live here. They'll be here all semester. So there's a lot of books on migration. There's a lot of Chris's books there, and this idea of the Odyssey and things like that. So please spend some time in here and look at that. As you may have already heard, we still have several performances left of cartography. Please come out. All students get free tickets. And if you want to come and you can't afford a ticket, please make sure you see us and we'll figure it out. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. We have some coffee and some pastries if you guys want to stick around and maybe have